Welcome to A-Push. Today we're going to be revisiting our old friend, the American South. As you hopefully remember from last semester, we've covered through the Reconstruction era, and so for the first half of this unit, the South was busy dealing with how they bring states back into the Union, who should be voting, who should be terrorized at night, stuff like this. So we're going to return to the American South about midway through this unit here and talk about how all of this industrialization affects or doesn't affect the way that the South operates. So without further ado, here are your objectives. Take a moment and make sure you understand them, and then let's dive in. So, as you hopefully remember, the American South declared independence from the North, seceded, and then was defeated in the American Civil War. This theoretically created some vast changes in the South, but also in a lot of ways the sort of establishment status quo re-emerged in the aftermath. And after the disputed election of 1876, Democratic control resumed throughout most of the southern states. But obviously, there's still some significant rebuilding to be done, and you can't totally turn the clock back because we've now amended the Constitution in order to make a number of things that used to be central to Southern life illegal. So, one thing you do start seeing during this time period is now that African Americans are no longer enslaved throughout most of the South, you start seeing migration slowly as African Americans move to areas where they figure they might have greater opportunity. In the early years, of course, this migration was relatively slow as African Americans usually lacked the economic resources to fully relocate, but it's going to speed up over time. And so here we see the Great Migration, which is, again, the migration of African Americans out of the South to both cities in the North and then, of course, to the West Coast. We should keep in mind that it's not really until the 1900s that this starts to pick up, and then really during and after the World Wars. But it is a phenomena that starts to happen in the late 1800s. So trends that pick up, that begin here, continue, and then accelerate going forward. One of the reasons that African Americans started leaving the South in larger numbers was the passage of Jim Crow laws. Hopefully we're familiar with Jim Crow laws. They were laws passed by Southern legislatures in order to legally ban African Americans from the public sphere and to establish this whole separate but equal legally segregated society. They were justified by a bunch of racist tracts like the prostrate state here, basically arguing that Reconstruction-era governments that included African Americans were hopefully corrupt, and falsely claiming that this proved that African Americans could not fully participate in American society. So we get the creation of these whites-only areas where specific professions, facilities, and privileges were given only to white people and were barred, or people of color were barred from it. And so we have all of these sort of Jim Crow era signs that seem very anachronistic and terrible to us today. But Southerners justified this for the same reasons that they justified slavery, inherently racist arguments. The Supreme Court case Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896 enshrined the doctrine of separate but equal. Homer Plessy tried to ride in the white section of a rail car when he was legally barred from doing so. He sued, and the Supreme Court ruled that as long as the facilities were equal, they could be separate, and it didn't violate anyone's civil rights. In practice, of course, as we know, the facilities were rarely equal, and the federal government, tired from Reconstruction and mostly focusing on the whole big business thing, didn't look too closely at this for about another 100 years. So what you end up getting is facilities that are theoretically supposed to be equal, but in reality are really, really, really not, which I think we probably already knew. We also get the disenfranchisement of African Americans through poll taxes and literacy tests. Of course, as we remember from last unit, the 15th Amendment enshrines the right to vote for all people, and so for all eligible voters, and so theoretically African Americans should have the right to vote, but by passing poll taxes, African Americans were disenfranchised. Poll taxes are a tax that you have to pay in order to vote. These taxes effectively disenfranchised African Americans because, as they were often caught in the sharecropper cycle of debt peonage, they rarely had the resources to vote. And of course, facing intimidation and other barriers, you had to decide, do you want to spend your scarce resources casting a ballot that might get you killed, or do you just want to not vote? Of course, poll taxes disenfranchised poor whites too, but for the Southern leadership, this was not necessarily a problem and was more of a perk than a glitch in the system. Literacy tests are tests that are ostensibly supposed to test your intelligence, but in reality are designed to be almost unpassable. I'll direct you towards question 20, and you can try to figure out how you would answer that question. And then, based on the color of your skin, I can tell you if your answer is correct or not correct. Because obviously, the very vaguely worded questions make it very easy to exclude the type of people that you want to exclude from the voting process. The Supreme Court also supported these things with, of course, both Plessy v. Ferguson, but also substantially weakening the Civil Rights Act. Specifically in the slaughterhouse cases, which you probably don't need to know the details of, but it's about a butcher, a slaughterhouse in Louisiana, dumping its sort of excess waste products into the water supply of an African-American community. But again, like Marbury v. Madison, you don't need to know that Black people's water was being contaminated. What you do need to know is that the Supreme Court decided that enforcing the Civil Rights Act was a state matter and not a matter for the federal government. So now the state of Louisiana is going to be in charge of protecting the civil rights of Black people, and I don't think I need to tell you how this is going to go. Plessy v. Ferguson, as we mentioned earlier, Homer Plessy was only 1/8 African American, and he tried to ride in a rail car. And he lost the case, which then upheld the legal principle of segregation. So Plessy v. Ferguson would be the law of the land based on a Supreme Court precedent until 1954, when Brown v. Board overturns it. But that's not for another 3 units. Ugh. Also, extralegal attacks and lynchings were common in order to reinforce and reinforce the white supremacy of the southern states. Lynching is when a mob of people basically grab a person and then kill them. Generally, this would be done to African Americans who sort of stepped out of the social order and who tried to exert their rights. And so it's a mode of terrorism in order to murder people in order to provide a lesson for others. And of course, although murdering people is illegal, all white juries, or mostly white juries, were able to generally would acquit the people who did the lynching. In fact, there's these weird holdover laws. For example, for a long time, juries in Louisiana did not have to be unanimous. Jury decisions in Louisiana did not have to be unanimous in order to specifically exclude the voices of Black jurors. So you could, with a supermajority of white jurors, you could acquit someone of lynching or convict someone of whatever crime you wanted, completely excluding any Black people who were brave enough to show up for jury duty, which of course many African Americans would not do that then because, again, the risk of being lynched. The evils of lynching, advocates tried to expose the evils of lynching. Most famously, Ida B. Wells spoke out strongly against lynching until she was forced to flee the South and set herself up in New York, continuing to publish anti-lynching tracts in order to try to focus the attention of the country on these horrible miscarriages of justice that were mostly being ignored in the American South. Finally, we get to the 2 most famous African American advocates of the era, Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. These 2 guys are, again, the most prominent African Americans during this time period. They grew up in very different situations. Booker T. Washington grew up enslaved in Alabama, whereas W.E.B. Du Bois grew up free in the North. Washington, of course, got his freedom after the Civil War and went on to be a tireless advocate for African Americans, whereas W.E.B. Du Bois, also tireless advocate, but also highly educated, got a doctorate from Harvard, the first person of color to do so. And they would have very different methods for how to improve the lives of African Americans. Du Bois focused on education, specifically technical education, starting up the famous Tuskegee Institute, which would educate African Americans and try to economically improve their lot. As you read in the documents, of course, Washington was willing to, for a time, forego civil rights in order to economically improve the status of African Americans. Whereas, and this would, of course, eventually lead to the creation of the historically black college system, as many of these schools set up during this time period would go on to educate the next generation of African American leaders fighting for greater rights and a larger place in society. On the other hand, W.E.B. Du Bois was one of the founding members of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Peoples, or the NAACP. They advocated tirelessly for increasing the legal status of African Americans, arguing that without legal protections under the law, African Americans could never significantly improve their economic standing. And so Du Bois believed that you needed to really enforce the 14th and 15th Amendments before African Americans could improve their lives. And so the NAACP put out a newspaper trying to basically champion the cause of Black civil rights. Then there's the South itself. The South, of course, as we talked about at the end of the Reconstruction unit, really stayed primarily agrarian and cotton-based, with the system of slavery being replaced by the debt peonage of sharecropping. But there were advocates like Henry Grady who wanted the South to industrialize, to take advantage of all this money flowing around in the Gilded Age, and to diversify their economies. But for the most part, it didn't happen. Hard feelings after the Civil War left many Southerners angry at the North over the whole, both freeing the slaves and then, of course, burning down Georgia and, et cetera. And so while there was significant Northern capital that could have been invested, in general, Southerners were not interested in industrializing and connecting their society through the Gilded Age. And so the South remained a sort of almost time capsule throughout this time period, as the country moved forward quite rapidly. The South more or less stayed frozen in place, and Henry Grady's New South did not really come to pass. And so although you do get some textile mills expanding in the South, for the most part, the South is going to look very similar in the 1900s than it looked in the 1800s. And sharecropping is still going to be the economic system, although white people are going to be included in the sharecropping system as well as people of color. And so the white aristocracy of the South is able to keep its underclass under control through keeping them in a constant cycle of debt. So here we go. Sharecropping expands. Now, both Black people and white people get to be in horrendous amounts of debt that keeps them in poverty and working land for more or less wealthy landowners or the modern equivalent of plantation owners forever. This brings us back to our central themes. Hopefully you can answer these questions in some detail, and then we'll move on and start looking at reform and eventually immigration.